Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. So today I'm going to talk to you about a work that's being conducted in my group at Duke University for last decade or so, combined with the outcome of one of the outcome of the COVID in my house is writing a book. So about which summarize some of the work and also adding some new component that I'm going to highlight in my talk today. Just background before I start. So my group trying to work on water quality issues, but and try to develop tools that enable us to understand the mechanism and the sources of water contamination through building a new isotopic tracer, geochemical tracer, and multiple tracer together to be able to delineate source of contaminant. And those groups, including my graduate student, former and current, that are being part of the studies that some of them I would publish, going to show you today. And of course, this work would never been taking place without the students, and it's important to highlight their impact. So, as you all know, we all use fossil fuel a lot, maybe not in Switzerland as much, but in the rest of the world, the majority of energy sources that we utilize is still based on fossil fuel. There is a major change that took place in the last 5 years about renewable energy, which I'm going to talk in the end of my talk. And the point that I'd like to emphasize in the talk is what we call the energy-water nexus. In every stage of energy development, through extraction of sources, through drilling, fracking, mining, through processing the product, and through generating power, we need and use a lot of water. At the same time, every time we use water for pumping, for transport, for treatment, we use a lot of energy. And that is the essence of the energy-water nexus, the interdependence of energy on water and the dependence of water utilization on energy. That's a concept of that. However, in many cases, the use at different stages of energy production or exploration causes water quality impact. That could be during coal mining. It could be during management or disposal of coal ash, the coal residue after coal combustion. It could be through shale gas and unconventional oil fracking or hydraulic fracturing, the way to call it, wastewater management, and also water that coming after electricity from a power station, which causes thermal pollution. So all of them would affect the water quality in a different way. And therefore, at those different stages of the energy-water nexus, there are water quality implications. And one of the target that and the focus of today is to try to quantify those red arrows that I'm going to show you here in order to understand the magnitude of this water contamination in terms of volume of that. That's one of the target of that. So previously, when people talk about water energy nexus, they've been talking about how much water we draw from the source, from which some of the water is returning back to the system. Water consumption, how much we actually use and not returning back to the system. But I argue that there is also another factor, which is impaired water, the amount of water that is being contaminated and not being able to be not part again of the hydrological system, and which has sometimes, as I'm going to show you, a huge water footprint that we typically don't take into account when we talk about the energy-water nexus. And that's kind of the focus of my talk today. So basically, I'm going to talk about some key issues. First, I'm going to show you some example from our research on unconventional oil and gas exploration and how it would affect the water quality, to give you some essence of how this is happening and why. And then I'm going to show you how we use different case studies to build a data set of global water use and global water quality impact from mostly focusing on fossil fuel. And then I will try to be optimistic. I know in this world it's not very easy to be, but try to look into the future and looking how solar energy actually can save water in a case study that we did in the US. And that's kind of the structure of my talk today. So I will start with the example of hydraulic fracturing and how it's affecting the water quality. And for those who are not familiar, unlike conventional oil and gas extraction that extract oil and natural gas from already geological trap, the idea with unconventional oil and gas that you have a well that's becoming horizontal within the target formation, and through a process of injection of mostly water and chemical, man-made chemical, and sand combined, generating high pressure that causing fractures in impermeable geological formation to make them permeable and allow natural gas and oil to be flowing and into the well. And shale gas became a major source of natural gas in the US and projected to be predominant source of natural gas. In the US, likewise, unconventional oil has become the major source of oil production in the US during the last 15 years or so. And the reason of that is the US is blessed with different, bless is a question, but one can argue, but contain, that a word perhaps, a major shale gas and oil basins, which are very close to the major infrastructure, and therefore the US is an example how those different basins that you can see them here in this map have been materialized into actually generating natural gas and unconventional oil. But I think the US example could be a way for the future, because if we look at the global shale gas reserve, we see it's all over the continent. It's not only the US. In fact, China has the largest shale gas and reservoir on Earth, also Northern Africa and South America, in addition to the US and Canada, which they're already being exploited. And therefore, when we talk about the US, some of the examples that I'm going to show you could potentially be the future if indeed shale gas will be developed in many of the countries. And likewise, tight oil reserve, we call it tight oil. It's those, again, the oil that's been extracted from impermeable formation through fracking is all over, including some basin in Russia, which is perhaps a bad news. But anyway, the fact is that it's all over and could be expanded in a large scale all over the globe. So that's open, a different kind of a topic. Many years people talk about the oil kind of the window, that there is a limit oil, and therefore we have to move into a different source of fossil fuel, but the discovery of unconventional oil put this in a very different perspective. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the oil aspect, but if you sum up the different component of what are the environmental factors that affecting that becoming because of unconventional oil and gas exploration, one can talk about a methane atmospheric emission, which I think this is one of the major issues, especially from unconventional oil, which is because of the type of the oil coming from the shale gas is mixed with gas. In many of the cases, the gas is not tapped, only the oil, and therefore it's actually being released to the atmosphere in many cases, has been demonstrated. People who are living next to those areas are suffering from air pollution. There is a water footprint that I'm going to talk today. There are surface water contamination that I'm going to talk today, some groundwater contamination. And the water disposal is one of the major issues that I'm going to talk what's in the wastewater, and also to mention that injection of the wastewater across the US has caused episodes of seismicity, earthquakes, that resulted from injection of a high volume of wastewater into areas that traditionally were not be subject to earthquakes. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the different environmental issues. And as a result, in different places around the world, including Europe, and I just learned today here as well in Switzerland, there was a lot of opposition to shale gas and unconventional oil and gas or fracking activities, and which causing limitation of the ability, for example, the basin of Paris, it could be a huge potential for oil, for unconventional oil and gas, and the French, for example, banned all fracking when it started to be a potential exploration of that. So, but much of, as many of environmental movement, in many cases, the kind of the resentment and the opposition is not based on fact. And one of the things we started to work on that, we tried to build the database that will enable to have a rational understanding of the risk and the impact on water resources. And one of the issues that many have been highlighted, do we have enough water for fracking? And the first question, what is the water footprint of hydraulic fracturing? Because many of those areas that I showed you before are located in areas that are having water scarcity and having water limitation. For example, the Permian Basin in Texas is the largest oil reservoirs on Earth. There can be production of unconventional oil for the next, 50, 100 of years, if not more. And this is one of the most arid places in the US, for example, not to mention North Africa, South Africa, and so on. So we conducted several studies in which we tried to quantify the amount of water that is coming from amount of water using for a shale gas. And the idea, again, is that you need the water for injection with the sand, with the fracking chemical, to open the fractured and enable for very impermeable unit to release the shale gas or the unconventional oil. And of course, there are other ways like CO2 that I haven't seen, except the studies that published about that, but I'm not sure it's being kind of implemented. And one of the things I learned about the industry, something that works, they don't want to change. So they've been using, in the US, for example, fresh water as a source of water for hydraulic fracturing. In China, in Sichuan Basin, they start using recycled water, the wastewater that I'm going to show you, as a source for hydraulic fracturing. Now, we found that the rising of shale gas development in the US has been associated with increasing the intensity of the water footprint. We showed that in this diagram that the larger the length of the horizontal wells associated with more water to be used. And what we see here is the changing in time of the magnitude of the water, of the gas and water use for hydraulic fracturing between 2011 and 2016. This is the data set that we use, and we can see the rise of the amount, the water footprint of up to 770% of water use, that just because of larger and length of those wells. Which again, raising the question about the sustainability about this water footprint over time. And then the issues of the flowback water. And the flowback water is the water that coming from the well after together with the gas. And one of the things that we found, that much of the water that is injected during hydraulic fracturing is actually captured within the shale formation. So basically, the idea is in this kind of a diagram that try to illustrate the different stages of hydraulic fracturing. In the first high pressure injection and opening fracture, in which the water and those chemicals enter into and create the fracture, and we see capillary mobilization and putting the water, the injected water, into the pore space of the shale formation. And then the second phase of when the pressure goes down, the water and the gas entering from those fracturing, entering into the well, which and goes back to the surface. Now, as I mentioned, the amount of water that we put in is much smaller than the water that's coming out. As you can see in this diagram, in a huge difference. And one of the things we also found, that the water that's coming in terms of the chemistry is not the water that's coming out. So what's happening in this mechanism that have been established, that the water that entrapped within the pore space, reflecting the formation water within those shale formation, whereas the fresh water that's being used is actually entrapped within the shale. So we talk about the volume, and then, as I show you in a minute, we're going to talk about the quality of this water. But basically, what we also see, that hydraulic fracturing causing very short term of production of both natural gas and water. During the first 3 months, we see high production rate, which decreases over time very quickly, and then becoming kind of plateau over the lifetime of the well. So basically, one of the problem of hydraulic fracturing is the relatively short time of production in the beginning of the lifetime of a well. And that's why there's so intensity of shale gas and oil drilling, and because they need the production, and to keep it high, you have to keep drilling, which kind of the engine of that. So we see that after 3 to 6 months, we see a reduction in both the shale production, the shale gas production, and the water, the produced water that's coming of that. We have some data that we worked in China with the national oil company, the PetroChina, in which Sichuan Basin is the major production part of that. And similarly, we saw that the first few months is high production of both natural gas and water, and then it's declined very quickly over time. And comparing the different basins from the US and China, we see the similar pattern of very high production early phases, and then it decreases over time. But given that we see intensification of shale gas over, as I showed you for the water use, we see similar intensification of the water, that the flowback water, the volume of that over time, and we can see that much more flowback water has been generated because of the larger length of the shale gas well and because of the increasing intensity of that. And it's true for natural gas, and it's true also for flowback and produced water. So basically, we see that the rise of shale gas in the US increased both the water use and also the intensity and the amount of the wastewater. This flowback produced water is the wastewater that's coming from that. So what they do with this wastewater? Most of it's disposed, injection into a deep wells. That's actually caused seismicity, induced seismicity, because in some cases it was located near geological kind of faults. Sometimes it was some treatment and released to the environment, which was not much kind of need the technology and cost. And sometimes it was not treated at all, as I'm going to show you in some places in the US, and just being dumped to the rivers. And of course, reuse, as I mentioned, some places they are taking the flowback water and reuse it for hydraulic fracturing. And some places, they call it beneficial use. They're trying to use it for irrigation, some places in Western United States. But what are the limiting factors for reuse and management of this water? And of course, the water quality is the key. Wastewater from hydraulic fracturing having a lot of chemicals. But some of the myths that people of environmental group thought, most of the concern were about the man-made chemicals that are being added for fracking. And this was the major fears of any layman and every people. Some of those chemicals can be toxic, some of them are carcinogenic. So there was a lot of fear about those man-made organic components. However, when we did the studies, we found that inorganic constituents in the flowback water, because of this exchange of the water, is actually much more predominant and much more affecting the environment. It's the salt, it's the radioactive element that are really highly abundant there. Those are the problematic constituents in the wastewater that causing. So I'm not saying it's good for you to drink wastewater from fracking, but the things that kill you will be not the man-made chemical. And each of them will have a differential effect on the environment of that. And some of the for example, you can see some of the paper we published. Basically, this pipe that you see discharge flowback from oil and gas produced water goes straight to the river and causing increase of the salinity, bromide, which I'm going to talk in a minute, and radioactivity into those impact water. Since I'm in Eawag, I have to talk about disinfection byproduct, right? And therefore, we also found that a discharge of brine containing bromide would affect the potential of taking this water downstream, and normal treatment of this water for disinfection would, because of the elevated bromide coming from mixing with the brine, causing the formation of disinfection byproduct in those downstream user from which they use the river water. It could be a couple of kilometers downstream for that. And we also found that the radioactive element that's part of the uranium decay series, which is highly abundant in the wastewater, when you dump this wastewater, you're causing accumulation of radium in the sediments of those sites where they dispose the wastewater. In fact, the level of radioactivity we found in those disposal sites actually they are exceeding the level that a normal landfill, radioactive landfill in the US, that you need a license for radioactivity site in all those, because of we're talking about a long-term accumulation of radium in those areas. So basically, there are a range of environmental issues that are derived mainly from the inorganic constituents in those wastewater rather than the man-made chemical. And again, the reason for that is that exchange of the water, that the water that's coming back to the surface is composed mainly on the brine that entrapped within the shell, and actually the water with the man-made chemical that we put in entrapped within the shell formation. So if I really want to upset environmental groups when I give this talk, I'm saying the best way to get rid of hydraulic fracturing fluid is through hydraulic fracturing, because it goes into the shell and it's gone from the surface. But anyway, usually doesn't end well. So having this kind of example, I want to go back to the big picture and basically and look in the global perspective about the fossil fuel. And this is data that we kind of generated and is more towards the book that I mentioned that we wrote. And looking at these sources of fossil fuel, and mainly oil, natural gas, and coal, and you see it's been increasing dramatically since we are talking here, including the time where we're talking about renewable, we still see a rise of fossil fuel utilization on a global scale. And the idea is, how can we quantify this impaired water, this water that I just mentioned is some example of contamination, how can we quantify that? And basically, we kind of try to understand and analyze the different stages of energy production. The upstream, what we call, is the time when you explored the source by drilling, by mining, by hydraulic fracturing. This is the early stages to get the energy, how much water we use, and later I also show how much water we contaminate. Then the next stage is the power generation, which I can tell you it's the largest stage of water consumption and withdrawal. And then the downstream, what's happened after we use it for the electricity or oil refinement or the coal combustion residue, the coal ash after the coal combustion. And basically, we're trying first to quantify how much water we use per energy using the most common unit of gigajoule per liter or liter per gigajoule, kind of trying to quantify that. And then the water, impaired water, is the volume of water that being contaminated because at the different stages that I just mentioned for this energy. And through the analysis of the study, we looked at the different case studies across the globe, including acid mine drainage, which is a huge water quality issues in India, for example, areas surrounding active, and even legacy of coal mining, including the US, the coal processing and cleaning, which has a huge water footprint in China, conventional and unconventional oil and gas. In fact, through the analysis, we discovered that the water footprint of conventional oil and gas is sometimes higher than unconventional. For example, the produced water, the volume of water that's coming as a produced water, with all those high salt radioactivity that I showed you before, it's actually occurring in conventional oil and gas. And until now, everybody, well, not everybody, but some were ignoring that. but only when it's becoming unconventional, people put attention into that. But that have a huge water footprint as well. Spills, we looked at the spill and tried to quantify what does it mean in terms of water quality and water quality quantification. And also in the US, for example, they take wastewater from oil and gas with all those constituents, and they sell it in some shop for de-icing. And people are using it in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the way they write on the labels, it's naturally occurring seawater, evaporated seawater. And you can use it in your yard for de-icing. So it's a very kind of common thing. So our analysis, it's not important, right, the numbers right now for you to absorb. You're welcome, but the point is that I'm trying to make here that through this detailed analysis, you can see here the numbers that we quantified. Here is the different stages of the life cycle of coal utilization, all the way from the different type of mining, subsurface, surface mining, through the processing of the coal, through the electricity production in coal plant, from data from US, data from China, and then into the end, what happened after you have the coal ash and how you manage the coal ash. And in the different colors, you can see the water consumption and water withdrawal. In the red, you can see the impaired water in each of those stages. And the really point that I'm going to highlight here, that the numbers for the impaired water in a different stage here, based on our analysis, is actually exceeding the water use that from direct water consumption and water withdrawal. So in other words, because of the water quality implication, we see that there is much more water that is, we don't see it usually, and we don't take it into account how much of the water footprint of energy is there, and it's much higher than the direct water that we are talking about. Likewise, when we're talking about the water intensity during the life cycle of shale gas, you can see the different colors for direct water withdrawal, water consumption in blue, whereas in the red are the water quality implication in different stages. Here is another example for, this was the shale gas, this is for oil, and you can see kind of the different numbers along the different stages. And it could be a multiple mechanism through transport, through disposal, through spills. All of them would have a different water footprint that, based on a specific case studies, we analyzed and provide the numbers here. So basically, the idea here is once you know the water footprint, which means liter per gigajoule for different energy development, or cubic meter for megawatt per hour for electricity production. And if you know those values and you convert, and you know the global energy production, you can convert this to the global water utilization. And that's what we did. We used those values that we developed through case studies and building the values to actually quantify how much water we use for fossil fuel. And the number is pretty large. And the water withdrawal, direct water withdrawal, is estimated as above 600 billion cubic meter per year, in which coal is taking 62%. Mentioned this for the German who are using now coal. Natural gas follows 33%. Oil is much less for that. And most of the withdrawal is through the power generation, the coal plant or even natural gas plant that are being used. For water consumption, we estimated about 58 billion cubic meter per year. This is the water that is not coming back into the hydrological system. It's the water that we consume and take it away, from which coal, again, is the larger having footprint, oil 34%, natural gas only 9%, relatively much smaller. And the most of the consumption is through the upstream stages. So it's interesting, the water withdrawal is taking during energy production, mostly coal plant or natural gas plant, whereas the water consumption is during the early stage, during mining, shale gas, and so on. So that's kind of trying to show the difference. The data is from data that we had for 2019. And basically, we kind of show the distribution of both the water consumption and water withdrawal. But then we also went and estimated what is the global wastewater that's being generated from fossil fuel. And we built, again, based on actual case study that we looked at the literature, our own data, what is the ratios for each amount, for example, produced water, how much for volume of oil to the amount of the produced water that generate from oil. It's interesting that conventional oil generate ratios of 5:1 more produced water, whereas unconventional is the ratio of 1, which means much less per energy produced water. Natural gas is much, much smaller volume, and coal, based on the China data, it's about 2 cubic meter for a 1 metric ton of coal to being utilized. And coal ash, we use the USGS, the EPA, data on wastewater. And basically, we came up that our estimate that we're talking about the 43 billion cubic meter of wastewater in different water quality that are being generated every year from global consumption of fossil fuel, from which oil wastewater is the predominant, followed by coal wastewater. But the point here, that this is really the important thing, those numbers are only the tip of the ice. And if you look at the water intensity that I mentioned before for the for the different water quality impact, and you can see here a different numbers for representing, for example, for the coal mining, for the legacy of coal mining. So even if the coal mining stopped to operate in Ohio 50 years ago, the meteoric water that's washing those coal mines still generating acid mine drainage, still today. And therefore the stream, the impact stream with acid mine drainage, have a huge volume of water that, if you take into account, making the impaired water much larger than the actual amount of water that's being generated. So we cannot really estimate the global water, the impaired water, because a case of acid mine drainage in northern US will be different than China because of the climate. So it's very difficult to build a global database for how much water being contaminated overall. Maybe someone can do it, but we can just give the baseline from which how much water has been used, and this is the minimum effect, and the water quality would add much higher volume of water that being impaired because of the energy development. Now, in our book, we call the energy water anthropogenic cycle. So we are talking about kind of a cycle that's happening that with the growth of population, growth of kind of increasing standard of living, we need more water and we need more energy. And the more water we use, the more energy we use as well. At the same time, given that the energy source is fossil fuel, we increase the emission of the carbon and methane, CO2 emission to the atmosphere, which makes water availability in many parts of the world more scarce, more limited, as we see in the Middle East and we see in Western US, in many semi and arid places. And therefore, we need more water to compensate with the kind of reduction in water availability. We need more energy to treat the water. We need, or to bring the water from high water, like in China, bringing from the south to the north. So we need more energy to do that. And in that, we're increasing more carbon emission, more water becoming now contaminated because of this human development. And as a result, it's kind of an endless loop of continuously energy and water consumption, which make water availability less and less available. And this kind of a negative kind of a loop. So how to break this loop? And one of the way to look at that is to look at the water intensity of the different water source. And what you can see here, that unlike the fossil fuel sources that have relatively high water footprint, that's reflecting how much water we use for mining, fracking, for electricity generation, for cooling coal plants, and so on. Renewable energy, in particular solar and wind, has orders of magnitude lower water intensity. And therefore, that gave the inspiration to think about it, whether if we put solar, can we save water? And basically, the real inspiration is that I put solar in my home. This is a picture of my home. And I was thinking, okay, now in my special app that I can have in my iPhone, I can see how much energy, how much electricity I generated today versus how much electricity coming from the grid. Now, if it's coming from the grid, North Carolina, what does it mean? Coal, natural gas, and nuclear, and all of them having a huge water footprint. So by converting into solar in my home, I actually eliminate the water that would otherwise the electricity that would otherwise consume a huge volume of water. So basically, I did this exercise across the US, in which calculate in each state, based on the distribution of energy sources for the state, I calculate how much water they use. This is a virtual water because this is not the water actually used in the home, but this is the water they use in the state for coal, for natural gas, for nuclear, and from hydro if they have that. Hydro, by the way, it's a huge water consumption, not here in Switzerland, but in California, because of the huge evaporation in arid areas. So the reservoir there you have a huge water loss just because of evaporation. So each state we calculate based on knowledge of the water intensity values, we calculate how much water they generate in each state. And then we convert it for a different, for the household in the different states. So we can calculate how much water from the grid actually generate in each house. And then we compare it to how much water, the water intensity of generating solar panel. Because one interesting thing, solar panel mostly being generated somewhere in China, being imported to the US. There is a water footprint in this generation, but it's a really, really small. And we took this into the consideration into this calculation. Doing this, we calculated that installing a solar panel in homes would have differential effect across the US, but the amount of water we're saving would rise, especially in the Western state, to 1,000% per house a reduction in water use because of the conversion from using electricity in the grid to a household electricity. And therefore, the future is therefore, if installing solar or converting into solar, I hear there is a kind of controversial here. It's debate. Maybe the scenery would not be as nice, but it could be a huge saving from not only for the CO2 emission and the carbon emission to the atmosphere, but also from the water footprint, and especially in countries where the water is a limiting factor. So by that, if you really want to know and you're really bored, have nothing else to do, you're welcome to look at this book and see how we actually made those calculations and those evaluations. Thank you.